Welcome to Life Planning 101, brought to you by Smart Money Group and Kennedy Financial Services in Eastland, Texas. Tune in every week as we share important information to help you and your family live life on purpose. Insurance, investments, legacy and tax planning, and much more. All covered now on Life Planning 101.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our program. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I'm Stace Gaddy. Angela Robinson from Kennedy Financial Services, our guest and expert. Another edition of Life Planning 101. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning, and you bet it is another edition. And as always, it will be a great show, and you don't want to miss anything that we have to talk about. And I want to actually tell you what the topic is, but behind that, I want you to listen to the story before you say, well, this just doesn't apply to me, because it is very interesting. The topic today, we're going to be talking about the finance of remarriage. And it's so funny because most people are in a marriage and they say, well, if my husband or wife is gone, they pass away, I'll never remarry. I won't do that. And I can't tell you how many people that we actually work with that, they are in a third marriage or a second marriage late in life, and not because it's the love of their life, but because they want to have some kind of companion, right? Somebody to be able to do things with and to share time with. And so I think that's really important. But funny story. So we're helping someone with their estate planning, and this has been a couple weeks ago, and we're talking about this, and we get pretty hot and heavy on the what ifs, and we call it our devil's advocate conversation.
Yeah.
It's not something that you want to talk about, but sometimes it's something that you need to talk about, and we're going to talk about why that is so important today. And so they left, and the lady that was there, she was a little bit in a mode of, oh, I just don't think I'll ever get remarried. And she came back next time I saw her, and she said, you know what? I've decided. I'm not going to remarry. I'm making a vow. Write it down. Make me sign it. I told all my friends. Everybody knows I'm never going to get remarried.
Okay.
And I sit there just looking at her, shaking my head. She says, you don't think I'm telling you the truth, do you? And I said, well, our experiences told us that typically there is a chance of remarriage. So, it doesn't matter, if you've been through a divorce or if you're widowed or you're a widower, that there is a chance that you could end up needing to get remarried or wanting to get remarried. And, another lady I love, one of the clients that we've worked with for several years, she says, I am not going to be a nurse or a purse. I refuse to do it.
That cuts right to it, doesn't it?
It does. But I always remind her, I said, sometimes we can't help who we fall in love with. And that's so true. And, at the same time, though, you do have a lot of conflicts. You have kids in the mix of remarriage and how to handle that situation. And what if your finances are completely different, in that remarriage? What if one of you has a lot of assets and wealth and income and the other one doesn't? Or what if you both have a lot of assets and wealth and income? Or what if neither of you have a lot of assets, wealth, and income? How do you handle all those different types of situations, right? And then on top of that, you have the remarriage itself, just the habits. I always gave my brother a hard time because when he was turning 30, and he's well over 30 now, so, I can give him a hard time on the radio show. Everybody knows him here in Eastland. And this is my middle brother, but I always gave him a hard time when he was around 30 years old. I said, don't you know that once you turn 30, you become set in your ways and nobody's going to want to take you? I said, you really get stuck in your habits. And I kept
That's true.
But it is, Stace. It is. We all kind of get our habits. And if you've been married before, believe it or not, you had habits in that marriage before. So, having that remarriage, what does that mean for habits? What does that mean for anxiety, stress, anger, frustration, right? And all of those things can be a big proponent. And especially when you involve finances in the mix. We talk all the time about the psychology side of money on the show, right? Because you are, no matter how you want to label it, you're emotionally attached to your money in some way because you worked very hard to earn it. You understand the value of that dollar, right? Or your children do, or your spouse does. And no matter how you look at it, some of us lean towards the way of greed, some of us lean towards the way of fear, but we're driven by one of those two things in life because, I always say, money shouldn't be, it can be the root of all evil if you let it, and it shouldn't be your life, but it's kind of like oxygen. You got to have it to be able to live. So you can't live without it. And so how do you detach yourself that it doesn't rule you? You rule your money. Does that make sense?
Yes, not chasing it.
That's right. That's right. And you can be a victim to that very easily in remarriage, because here's what happens. It's not only your psyche with money, but now you've just involved a new family, which may include a spouse, may include their children, may include grandchildren, plus your children, your grandchildren. You know, how do they feel about this situation, right? Even if they're young, if they're old, it's probably worse when they're older. But, you know, everything kind of has its way. So we're going to be talking a lot about that. We're going to be talking about merging your assets. We're going to be talking about estate planning. We're going to talk about just talking it over and the total finance of remarriage. Great topic, great show. You don't want to miss it.
Certainly is. The finance of remarriage. More Life Planning 101 right after these messages. Welcome back in, everyone, to the second segment of Life Planning 101. The finance of remarriage, our topic. As always, Angela Robinson, great topic.
Thank you. And so we were talking before the break, you know, really about this finance of remarriage. And what that really means is, you know, we can't help who we fall in love with. And sometimes, and I will say, you know, I still know my grandmother to this day. I know that my grandfather was the love of her life. And, you know, she remarried after he was gone. And it really wasn't for that, because she, you know, we call it puppy love, right? They ended up, you know, being able to do things together and have that relationship together. But, you know, when you did that, that was actually her third marriage. So you blended 3 families. Think about that. Mm-hmm. There's a lot there, a lot of things to consider. So, you know, first thing and foremost, and I know this is very uncomfortable. A lot of people, and especially we live in the Bible Belt, and we've encountered this so many times. And we actually, one time we had a preacher come into our office with the new couple that was about to wed.
Yes.
And suggest that they not get a prenup. One of them was very wealthy, and the other one had not a penny to his name. So, true nurse or purse, right? But, you know, we do live in this Bible Belt, and I do respect that in so many ways, because people do have different opinions. And I think we all have to respect each other's opinions and the way that our beliefs make us act in our life. And that's really, really important and has to be thought about. But I also want you to think about on the back end of this, okay, the grief, the hardship, the stress that can occur from the lack of planning or the lack of so-called talking it out. And what we always encourage couples to do, because discussing this can be very uncomfortable, but you know, the end of your previous marriage, whether it was either divorce or being widowed, was probably a crash course in finances, most likely.
Yes.
One way or the other. And, you know, one thing is you don't want to create past experiences that negatively impact the future. And, you know, an example of that would be, let's say, for instance, that you don't pay a bill and it, you know, it ends up being late and there is a phone call into your house. Well, what if that other spouse was accustomed to their last spouse doing that all the time, and it was an embarrassing thing to them and it triggers something emotionally? We don't think about that stuff happening, but it is very true. So I think it's very important that you discuss how your finances are going to be handled ahead of time, and, you know, within the first 6 months of your marriage. And that's not necessarily a fun topic of conversation, right? Because marriage is not supposed to be about finances, but and then again, it is about finances.
And it's one of the biggest causes of divorce.
That is true. That is true. So you have to go through that conversation. And we often act as a mediator there, because we talk about the pros, cons, options of merging finances, talking about the estate planning, you know, and that neutrality is really, really important, because both of you are going to be very passionate and very emotionally attached to the situation, right? And that's really important. So, you know, merging your assets, let's just look at that, because there's really 3 ways to do this when you get remarried. You can either do one pot, basically combining everything together, right? You could do 2 pots, and each has its own, and then 3 pots. You know, you each have your own, but then for joint expenses, you do kind of a joint account. And that can work. And each has its purpose and place. You know, there is no one size fits all here. And you know, you hear me say that all the time on the show, that I can't just give you a piece of advice because I don't know your situation. It's what's unique to you, right? Because if you do one pot, that might work if you have no kids, no ongoing financial obligations, and pretty simple spending habits. But did you know that if you commingle your money, in any sort of fashion, if you had assets prior to the marriage, now you've commingled those assets if they were income producing. Often people don't realize that. So for instance, let's say that you have a house that was prior to the marriage that you kept in your individual name, and it was a rent house, but that rental income was coming into the joint account. Well, guess what? You've just commingled that asset.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people don't realize things like that it isn't just that simple. Another thing to consider is later down the road. We don't want to ever think about having to go into care, long-term care of some sort, because our health fails us. But, it could happen. And what would happen to your family in that situation if everything was put together? How hard would it be for them to break that back apart? Have you thought about that? Or what if one of you didn't have long-term care and the other one did? How are you protected in that situation? So there's a lot to that, more than just, oh, we're married, we should have one checking account together now. So you really have to think about that. And then, if you think about the opposite of that, having two pots, right? That may work very good for an autonomous couple that really has his and her expenses, but you're gonna have those joint expenses. So how do you handle those joint expenses without it being draining on your relationship? Because the truth be told, we all know finances, like you just said, Stace, is number one cause of a divorce.
Sure is.
And if you can't get along about who should be paying what, or, oh, you spent too much money there, or this or that, or, then you've got real big issues. And, we always talk about overlapping gaps in people's plan. And I think that's a huge overlapping gap in people's plan if they work in separate manners. Doesn't mean that two pots aren't bad, but you need to put it in writing and know exactly who is going to pay what every single month, and have a conversation so that it isn't draining. Do it ahead of time. Have it in stone.
Before we go to break, when we need to, can you tell us quickly about three pots, though?
Three pots. Three pots is, you have their two pots that are separate, and then you have those joint account for like shared expenses, such as households bills every single month. And, that might work really well. And a lot of times it's usually the best thing to be able to do. But again, you've got to be very, 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 very careful, because it's not just the expenses that come into play here. It's also comes into play about assets and how those line out, how they're actually declared, what would actually happen if you were to need to get on Medicaid. What would that do to your future spouse? Or what about if you were to die? Would those be commingled and go to children that you never even knew? So you got to think about those things.
Mm-hmm. So many questions. And you need an expert, folks. I mean, that's fair to say.
Absolutely.
And honestly, I would say this. Yes, this is Life Planning 101, and it's Kennedy Financial, and we have a relationship, and this is a show that we do. But seriously, put all that aside. Did you hear all of those complicated questions that Angela brought up? You need help with that. That's not even a promotion, Angela. It's just a fact.
It is. And, we have a saying, Stace. It's not what you don't know that will hurt you. It's what you don't know that you don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's true, because if you don't know the right questions to ask, how do you know that you need to be answering them?
Exactly right. You don't even know the right questions. Well, that's what Angela Robinson and Kennedy Financial Services can help you determine. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back with our final segment right after these messages. Welcome back in, folks, to Life Planning 101, our third and final segment for today's program. Here's Angela Robinson.
Yes, and we've been talking about the finance of remarriage, and so far we've kind of talked about how to manage it during the remarriage, but something that's very important and often overlooked is creating that estate plan. Because when you do get remarried, you need to make sure things are set in stone if you're blending families. It's no longer just a simple his and her will. Think about it. I want you to think about if you have assets today, you were to get remarried, and all of a sudden you pass away and everything goes to that new spouse. Guess what you just did? You disinherited your children and your grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
Are you okay with that? Would your deceased husband or ex-husband be okay with that? Right? Or wife, and that I always say I pick on the husband because men usually die first. But it is true.
No comment.
No comment, right? Yeah, and that could be changing. Women are in the workforce. We're getting more stress. Yeah, you never know. You might have hope in the future.
No comment.
But, creating this estate plan is really important. In fact, I want to share with you a little story. Very interesting, because not all remarriages are good remarriages. We actually were privy to this firsthand. We actually had a lady that had been our client since 1992. And every time we went down to see her, her legal documents had been changed by her and her husband. He had somehow gotten her to go to an attorney every single time after we left to get her to put him in charge of everything. What do you think that did?
Man, that seems like a big pile of trouble to me.
Yes, and it gave him access to everything.
Makes him in control.
That's right. So, what does that mean, right? Well, if you go back to what her goals and her previous husband, she was a widow, and what her previous husband's goals were was, if she were to get remarried and it was somebody that she loved and cared about, she wanted them to be taken care of, but she wanted anything left to be able to go to her kids and her grandkids. And, that's not an uncommon thing. That's not an unreasonable thing at all. And so there is ways to be able to set this up and get it soundproof. The best way to set it up is when you're in that first marriage and you get everything set up and solid, right then. But that often doesn't happen. And especially if you're a young person, it's almost impossible to do that. Because you want to have flexibility in your plans. So you've got to be very careful there. So, what we did was we did end up setting things in stone from that point forward. We ended up setting up a trust that would pay out her husband, the expenses that he needed to keep up the house and live there. And the house actually was inside the trust. Everything was inside the trust for his benefit until his death. And then it could go back to her family. So things can be set up appropriately to take care of it. But the big thing is that most people don't take the time or the thought to do it, or they're so much in puppy love, they have a hard time addressing this situation. It's a hard conversation, right? And, the biggest thing I always think about is, what if you developed dementia or Alzheimer's and something wasn't set up appropriately, and that new husband, not that he was a snake in the grass, but what if he didn't know how to do things appropriately? And because of that, you disinherited your children. And what does that make Christmases and Thanksgivings like after you're gone? We always have that question, right? We want Christmases and Thanksgivings after we're gone. So, it's really important to be able to do that. Taxes are another thing. One of the things we always think about is, do you file a joint tax return or an individual tax return after you get married? And what's the difference in it? We talked a little bit about that earlier, about those commingling of assets, and income in the state of Texas actually traces the asset back to whoever it's reported on both tax returns for. Think about that.
So much to think about.
Yes. So, this estate planning, can't just always be solved by a prenup, for sure. Now, or a postnup, and those are good things and things that can help. But you've got to think beyond that. You've got to have things really looked at with an X-ray, an MRI into it, and make sure things are set up very appropriately. Beneficiary designations are another one. Upon remarriage, I think this is one of the most overlooked things that people forget to do, is change their beneficiary designations. In fact, we had this happen. A gentleman had an outside life insurance policy that went to his ex-wife when he died. He was remarried, but it went to his ex-wife. Okay.
What?
Yep, that's right. And what if you had an ex-spouse that was deceased? Now you got all kinds of problems, because that can cause serious complications.
Oh, the paperwork.
Yeah, so don't forget about those beneficiary designations. And often, a lot of times, I see people have problems too because they have young children or young grandchildren, and they'll try to list them. Remember, you can't list a beneficiary that's under the age of 18 in the state of Texas. And really, do you want to give an 18-year-old a lump sum of money?
Yes.
You might want to think about that. So these are all little caveats that's really important. We always talk about what it means to live life on purpose. And that is different for everybody. There's no doubt about that. But I think everybody has a common goal to get rid of complexity and stress in their life so they can focus on those things that are important.
Mm-hmm.
And when you just get this out in the open and you take care of it ahead of time, guess what you just got rid of?
Stress.
The stress and complexity.
You've simplified.
That's right. So, take this opportunity that, if you're in your first marriage, if you're in a second marriage, if you're considering a second marriage, address it. Doesn't matter where you're at in life, address it. Know what would happen. Not a great conversation to have, but know what would happen. So with that, My name is Angela Robinson with Kennedy Financial Services here in Eastland, Texas. Thanks for listening to our show, and God bless.
Thank you, Angela. Beautifully done as always, and God bless you, your family, and Kennedy Financial Services for all that you do. Join us again next time, folks, for more Life Planning 101.
Thank you for joining us for Life Planning 101, brought to you by Smart Money Group and Kennedy Financial Services. If you have questions, you can email them to lifeplanning@kennedy-financial.com. Be sure to tune in next week for more Life Planning 101. The opinions expressed herein are those of the firm and are subject to change without notice. The opinions referenced are as of the date of publication and are subject to change due to changes in the market or economic conditions and may not necessarily come to pass. Any opinions, projections, or forward-looking statements expressed herein are solely those of the author, may differ from the views or opinions expressed by other areas of the firm, and are only for general informational purposes as of the date indicated. Securities offered through Calton & Associates Incorporated, a registered investment advisor, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Smart Money Group LLC. Kennedy Financial Services and Smart Money Group LLC are separate entities and are not owned or controlled by Calton & Associates Incorporated.